The spring of 1945. Europe lay shattered after nearly 6 years of relentless bloodshed. Cities reduced to rubble, nations divided, and armies stretched to their breaking point. Yet in the western reaches of Germany, a final act of the war was about to unfold, one that would see nearly 500,000 German soldiers lay down their arms rather than fight on against the advancing Americans. This mass surrender was not simply a collapse of morale. It was the result of exhaustion, desperation, and the cold realization that the war was lost. For these battle-hardened veterans, men who had fought at Stalingrad, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, it was the end of a journey that had taken them from the heights of conquest to the depths of defeat. To understand how so many men surrendered in such a short span of time, we must step back to the final winter of the war in Europe. The collapse of the Western Front. By early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling on all sides. To the east, the Red Army was pouring into Poland and pushing toward Berlin with unstoppable momentum. To the west, the Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, the great natural barrier that once shielded Germany from invasion. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared fighting machine in the world, was now a shadow of itself, undermanned, undersupplied, and cut off from reserves. For the German High Command, the situation was dire. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, was tasked with defending Western Germany. His forces were spread thin, demoralized, and overwhelmed by superior Allied firepower. Model knew the odds were hopeless, but he clung to orders from Hitler himself: no retreat, no surrender. The Reich demanded that every man fight to the last bullet. But reality was merciless. Desertion rates skyrocketed, units disintegrated, soldiers who once marched with pride under the swastika now trudged through mud and ruins, hopping only to survive. The question was no longer how to win the war but how to escape annihilation. The Ruhr Pocket. At the heart of this story lies the Ruhr region, the industrial powerhouse of Germany, vital to its war economy. In April 1945, American forces executed a brilliant maneuver, encircling over 300,000 German troops in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. This was a disaster for the Wehrmacht. Inside the pocket were some of Germany's most experienced divisions, men who had survived years of brutal combat. But trapped, without adequate food, fuel, or ammunition, they faced the grim prospect of starvation or slaughter. The Americans, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, applied relentless pressure. Artillery thundered across the region. Bombers darkened the skies. Tanks rolled into towns already shattered by years of bombing raids. The German soldiers, once proud warriors, now huddled in basements, cut off from reinforcements, abandoned by their leaders. For many, surrender was no longer cowardice, it was survival. The psychology of surrender. But why did so many German troops choose to surrender to the Americans and not fight to the bitter end as Nazi propaganda demanded? The answer lies in a combination of fear, pragmatism, and bitter calculation. These men had seen what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands. Tales of massacres, reprisals, and brutal treatment of prisoners spread like wildfire through the ranks. In contrast, the Americans represented something different: food, shelter, perhaps even dignity. German soldiers calculated their chances. To fight on meant certain death. To surrender to the Soviets meant likely suffering or execution. But to surrender to the Americans, this, at least, offered a chance at life. And for men who had endured years of hell, the hope of survival outweighed the empty promises of Hitler's regime. Thus, when the encirclement tightened and the artillery shells screamed overhead, thousands laid down their weapons. They emerged from forests and ruins, hands raised high, uniforms tattered, faces gaunt. For some, it was the first breath of freedom in years, not freedom in the political sense, but freedom from war, from death, from a cause that had long since lost its meaning. A sea of prisoners. What followed was unprecedented. American troops found themselves facing not a few hundred prisoners, but tens of thousands at a time. Columns of Germans stretched for miles, men in gray uniforms marching without resistance, their weapons abandoned, their eyes empty. The sheer scale stunned even the Americans. One U.S. officer described it as like a river of men flowing endlessly toward captivity. Camps hastily erected to hold prisoners quickly overflowed. Fields were transformed into makeshift pens where barbed wire encircled seas of defeated soldiers. The Wehrmacht that had once conquered half of Europe now stood disarmed, powerless, and utterly defeated. And yet, this was not the end of the story. For within the Ruhr Pocket, German commanders still debated whether to resist or surrender. For some, obedience to Hitler outweighed reason. For others, surrender was the only way to save their men from destruction. The question that lingered: how long could the pocket hold out? And would its leaders dare defy Hitler's orders in the face of inevitable collapse? Inside the Ruhr Pocket, chaos reigned. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, faced an impossible choice. His orders from Hitler were clear: fight to the death, but the reality on the ground told a different story. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, fuel was gone, food supplies dwindled to nothing. Entire divisions were reduced to ragged bands of men with little more than rifles and bayonets. Model was a hardened soldier respected even by his enemies for his skill and loyalty, but he was also a realist. He knew his army could not break out. Still, he could not bring himself to openly surrender. For a man bound by decades of service, surrender meant dishonor, and perhaps worse, execution if he were ever judged by the regime he had once served. As the Americans closed in, Model disbanded his command, telling his officers and men they must decide for themselves. Some would slip away in civilian clothes, others would surrender en masse. Model himself refused to capitulate. In the end, cornered and unwilling to face capture, he took his own life. His death marked not only the end of Army Group B but also the collapse of German resistance in the Ruhr. The surrender unfolds. With leadership dissolved, the German troops inside the Ruhr had little choice left. By mid-April 1945, the trickle of surrenders became a flood. Entire divisions marched out of forests and fields, approaching American lines with white flags improvised from sheets or scraps of cloth. Some came in trucks that had run out of fuel miles earlier. Others stumbled barefoot, having worn through their boots in retreat. Their commanders, powerless, often walked alongside them. Men who once carried iron crosses and barked orders now reduced to silent figures in defeat. American soldiers were astonished by the sight. Instead of bitter last-ditch fighting, they were confronted with a human tide. The Wehrmacht, once considered nearly invincible, was handing itself over willingly. In towns like Remagen, Hagen, and Wuppertal, entire garrisons surrendered without firing another shot. In just days, over 300,000 men were in American hands. Combined with smaller pockets across the region, nearly 480,000 Germans were captured rather than risk annihilation. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Life as a prisoner. But surrender did not mean freedom, at least not yet. The sheer number of prisoners overwhelmed the U.S. Army. Camps hastily thrown together were packed beyond capacity. Barbed wire enclosures filled with seas of gray uniforms stretching as far as the eye could see. Prisoners slept in the open, huddled under blankets or greatcoats. Rations were meager at first as Allied supply lines were strained to the breaking point. Yet compared to the horror stories of the Eastern Front, these conditions were a blessing. German soldiers knew that by falling into American hands, they had escaped the vengeance of the Red Army. Here, at least, they were given a chance to survive. Some even expressed relief, confessing to their captors that surrender felt like liberation not from the enemy but from Hitler's war itself. American guards, many of them young men barely out of high school, suddenly found themselves responsible for entire armies of enemy soldiers. They struggled to maintain order, but for the most part, the prisoners were too exhausted, too broken to resist. A nation's defeat. The surrender in the Ruhr Pocket marked more than just the capture of 500,000 men. It symbolized the death of Hitler's Germany. The Wehrmacht, once feared and respected, could no longer defend its homeland. What remained was a hollow shell, bled dry by years of total war. Soldiers who had once fought with fanaticism now recognized the futility of resistance. Their loyalty to the Führer had eroded. Their faith in victory was gone. For the Allies, the capture of so many troops was both a triumph and a logistical nightmare. Yet strategically, it ensured that Western Germany was finished. The road to Berlin was now open. Within weeks, the Reich itself would cease to exist. The human cost. Behind the statistics of 480,000 men lay countless individual stories. Fathers, sons, brothers, ordinary Germans who had been swept into the machinery of war. Some had fought since the first days of Poland and France. Others had been conscripts, barely trained, thrust into the chaos of a dying Reich. Their surrender was not just military defeat, it was a collapse of belief. Many had once embraced Hitler's promises of glory and empire. But now, reduced to prisoners behind barbed wire, they faced the bitter truth: the war had brought only ruin, not greatness. Some wept as they surrendered. Others stared blankly, numb after years of violence. A few clung stubbornly to Nazi ideals, even in captivity, but most were simply relieved it was over. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ruhr Pocket, the battlefield was littered with the remnants of a defeated army. Abandoned tanks lay rusting in fields, artillery pieces pointed uselessly toward the sky, and burned-out vehicles clogged the roads. American troops advancing through the region described it as a graveyard of the Wehrmacht. But the true sight was not the equipment, it was the men. Endless columns of German soldiers streamed into captivity. Exhausted, gaunt, their uniforms torn and mudded, they walked in silence. For the Americans, it was a victory unlike any other, not just the capture of territory but the neutralization of an entire fighting force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself called it one of the most decisive actions of the war. By trapping and capturing nearly 500,000 men, the Allies had crippled what little remained of Germany's Western armies. The war in the West was effectively over. Managing the unimaginable. The sudden influx of prisoners presented the U.S. Army with an unprecedented challenge. No one had expected to process, feed, and guard nearly 500,000 men in such a short time. The solution was both improvised and brutal in its simplicity: massive open-air enclosures surrounded by barbed wire hastily constructed in the German countryside. These became known as Rheinwassenlager or Rhine meadow camps. Here, the prisoners lived under the open sky, thousands crammed into muddy fields with little shelter. Rations were minimal, medical care stretched thin. Some prisoners later remembered those first weeks as harsh and degrading, though not deliberately cruel. The Allies themselves were stretched to their limits, struggling to supply their own advancing armies. Still, compared to what might have awaited them under Soviet custody, most German soldiers considered themselves fortunate. Even with hunger, cold, and overcrowding, they survived. For many, survival alone was a victory. Shattered morale. For the German population, the surrender of nearly 500,000 troops was a crushing psychological blow. News spread quickly that entire armies had capitulated to the Americans. The myth of Nazi invincibility, already shattered by defeats on the Eastern Front, now lay in ruins on German soil itself. Families wondered about the fate of their husbands, fathers, and sons. Many never returned, not because they were executed but because captivity stretched on for months or years after the war ended. Within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, morale plummeted further. If the men of the Ruhr, battle-hardened veterans, had surrendered, what hope was left? Units still resisting further east saw the writing on the wall. Some fought on out of desperation, others simply to buy time for civilians to flee advancing Soviet forces. But increasingly, surrender became the only option. The political implications. For Hitler, the loss of the Ruhr was catastrophic. The industrial heart of Germany, its factories, steelworks, and coal mines, was gone. Without it, the Reich could no longer sustain even a semblance of war production. Inside his bunker in Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. But the truth was unavoidable. His armies were no longer capable of meaningful resistance. The Americans had destroyed his Western forces without a decisive battle, without the apocalyptic last stand he had demanded. In just a few weeks, Soviet troops would close in on Berlin itself. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in less than 12. A war of survival. For the soldiers who surrendered, the war did not end with the laying down of arms. It ended in captivity behind wire under watchful eyes of foreign guards. Some spent months in camps before release, others were transported across the Atlantic to the United States, where they worked on farms or in labor details. For them, survival became the new battle. Letters home, if allowed, carried little more than reassurances: "I am alive, I am safe, wait for me." Yet behind those words lay the trauma of defeat. These men had once marched as conquerors through Paris, Warsaw, and Kiev. Now they dug trenches in foreign soil as prisoners, stripped of weapons, stripped of pride. The symbolism of surrender. The surrender of nearly 500,000 German soldiers was more than a military event. It was a symbol of the war's endgame. The world had watched Nazi Germany rise with terrifying speed, conquering nations in months. But in the end, its armies collapsed not only under the weight of Allied firepower but also under the weight of their own exhaustion and disillusionment. The men of the Ruhr did not surrender because they were cowards. They surrendered because they saw no future in dying for a regime that had already destroyed their nation. In choosing captivity over annihilation, they made a final statement: that survival was worth more than blind obedience. As the Ruhr surrendered in the west, Berlin braced for destruction in the east. The Soviets were closing in, bringing with them an unstoppable tide of tanks, artillery, and vengeance. Every day, more German units collapsed, more commanders surrendered, and more civilians fled in terror. The surrender of nearly 500,000 men in the Ruhr Pocket had accelerated this collapse. The Wehrmacht could no longer defend two fronts. With the west gutted and the east overwhelmed, the so-called Third Reich had only days left to live. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He issued fantastical orders for counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed. He raged against his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. But outside his bunker, the war was slipping away. His armies were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting only to delay the inevitable. Surrender to the west versus the east. The surrender in the Ruhr also revealed something profound about the mindset of German soldiers in 1945. Where they surrendered mattered as much as if they surrendered. Word had spread of Soviet atrocities, entire villages burned, civilians massacred, prisoners executed in retaliation for years of German brutality in the east. Every German soldier knew what awaited them if they fell into Red Army hands. In contrast, surrender to the Americans or British was seen as survival. The Western Allies were still enemies, but they represented order, food, and at least the possibility of dignity. This choice was not abstract. Soldiers calculated their odds. When forced to choose between death in the east or captivity in the west, 500,000 Germans decided in unison: captivity was life. This explains why the Ruhr surrender was so massive, so unprecedented. It was not merely a military defeat. It was a conscious rejection of Hitler's suicidal orders. Soldiers voted with their feet, marching not toward the Soviets, not toward Berlin, but into the arms of the Americans. The human flood. For the Americans, the influx of prisoners seemed endless. Each day, new columns arrived, officers still carrying sidearms to hand over, veterans with medals pinned to ragged tunics, teenagers trembling in oversized uniforms. The numbers defied comprehension. In a single week, the U.S. Army took more men prisoner than had been captured in entire campaigns earlier in the war. Eisenhower's staff joked grimly that the Germans seemed to prefer surrendering to fighting. But beneath the humor lay an astonishing truth: Germany's war machine was collapsing from within. And yet, for the prisoners, this was not simply the end of the war. It was the beginning of years in captivity. Some would be shipped to camps in France, Britain, or even the United States. They would harvest crops, repair roads, or clear rubble from bombed-out cities. Their labor became part of the reconstruction of a world they had once tried to conquer. The death of Hitler's dream. The surrender of the Ruhr exposed Hitler's greatest illusion: that his soldiers would fight to the last man, that his people would sacrifice everything for him. Reality shattered that fantasy. 500,000 men chose life over death, survival over fanaticism. In doing so, they signaled the death of the ideology that had driven Germany into war. National Socialism demanded obedience until the grave. But these men, ordinary soldiers of the Reich, rejected that demand in their final act of defiance. The Reich was collapsing not just because of bombs and bullets, but because its own soldiers no longer believed. A turning point in memory. In the decades after the war, historians would look back at the Ruhr surrender as a pivotal moment, a symbol of both defeat and survival. For the Allies, it was proof that their relentless pressure had worked. For Germany, it was a reminder that even the most hardened armies cannot endure when their cause is lost. For the soldiers themselves, memory was more complicated. Some carried shame for having surrendered, others spoke of relief. Most said little, returning to civilian life after years of captivity, trying to rebuild in silence. Yet the fact remained: nearly 500,000 men hardened by years of war chose not to die for Hitler. In that choice, they revealed the true state of the Reich at its end: not glory, not loyalty, but exhaustion, despair, and a desperate grasp for survival. With the Ruhr Pocket eliminated, the Western Allies advanced across Germany with little resistance. The once feared Wehrmacht no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. What remained were scattered units, remnants of shattered divisions, Volkssturm militias, and teenagers pressed into uniforms far too large for them. To the east, the Soviet Union launched its final offensive against Berlin. Over 2 million men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged toward the German capital. The The battle for Berlin would be the last desperate stand of Hitler's regime, fought not for victory but for spectacle, for the illusion of defiance. But while Berlin burned, the West had already witnessed the truth. The German army no longer believed in its own cause. The surrender of nearly 500,000 men in the Ruhr was not only a military defeat, it was the spiritual death of the Wehrmacht. Hitler's last days. Inside his underground Führerbunker, Hitler raged as reports arrived of mass surrenders. To him, these men were traitors, cowards who refused to sacrifice themselves for his vision. He demanded that those who gave up be executed in absentia, though he had no power left to enforce such decrees. By the end of April 1945, Hitler knew the game was over, while American and British troops advanced unopposed through the West. Soviet artillery thundered just streets away from his bunker. On April 30th, he ended his life with a pistol shot, leaving behind a nation in ruins. His death marked not a noble last stand but the collapse of a dictator who had led his people to destruction. And the mass surrender in the Ruhr was the clearest evidence of that collapse, a rejection of his demand for total war until the last breath. The end of the war in Europe. Within a week of Hitler's death, German commanders sought unconditional surrender. On May 7, 1945, in Reims, France, the German High Command signed the documents that ended the war in Europe. The surrender of the Ruhr had paved the way for this moment. By capturing nearly 500,000 men, the Allies had stripped Germany of its ability to resist in the West. Without those armies, Berlin stood alone, a doomed city fighting a hopeless battle. The guns finally fell silent on May 8, Victory in Europe Day. For the first time in 6 long years, the people of Europe could breathe again. Legacy of the Ruhr surrender. In the years that followed, the story of the Ruhr became a symbol of the futility of Hitler's war. For Germany, it was a painful memory, a reminder that obedience to one man had led to catastrophe, and that only by rejecting his orders had hundreds of thousands survived. For the United States, it was proof of the effectiveness of overwhelming force and relentless pressure. The capture of so many men without prolonged slaughter demonstrated not only American strength but also the crumbling will of their enemy. For the men who surrendered, it was the beginning of a new life. Many spent years in captivity, some in America, others in Britain or France. They labored on farms, in factories, or clearing rubble from bombed cities. And when they returned home, they returned not as heroes but as survivors, men who had chosen life over death, even at the cost of pride. The human truth. Behind the staggering number 480,000 men lay a simple human truth. These were soldiers who had endured unimaginable years of war. They had seen comrades fall in Stalingrad, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. They had marched across half of Europe, only to retreat back into their own shattered homeland. By 1945, they no longer believed in victory. They no longer believed in Hitler. They believed only in survival. And so, when faced with the choice between annihilation and surrender, they raised their hands and walked toward captivity. In that moment, the war ended for them, not with glory, not with fanfare, but with a silent march into the unknown.